Have you ever lived a lie so perfect that discovering the truth would shatter everything you believed in? Today I'm going to tell you about Rosa, a 72-year-old woman whose happy marriage hid the most devastating secret a family could keep. What she discovered about her husband of 50 years will leave you breathless. Subscribe to our channel to receive stories that touch the heart and strengthen the soul. Because sometimes the most painful truths lead us to the most beautiful new beginnings. Have you ever felt that something in your life was too perfect to be true? My name is Rosa, and for most of my 72 years, I believed I was living a fairy tale. Picture this: a quiet morning, steam rising from a cup of coffee, made exactly how he liked it. Strong and black, with warm bread and melted butter. I'd stand in our little kitchen, watching Carlos on the porch, feeding the birds that came to visit us every dawn. We had that kind of love people write songs about. The kind where words weren't always necessary. A glance across the room, a gentle touch on the shoulder, and we'd understand each other completely. Our love story began when we were so young. I was barely 15 at the town's summer festival. I remember sitting alone in a corner, feeling out of place among all the dancing couples. Then Carlos appeared, asking if he could sit beside me. We talked until the sun came up, as if we'd known each other in another lifetime. From that night on, we were never apart. Our wedding was simple, but beautiful. My mother cried so much that day. I thought it was just joy, seeing her daughter so happy after a childhood marked by hardship. Today I know those tears carried a terrible secret I couldn't have imagined. Sigh. Our married life was filled with small, precious moments. Carlos tended our vegetable garden, while I cooked his favorite meals. Sunday afternoons brought our children and grandchildren, filling our home with laughter and tiny footsteps running through the halls. On my 60th birthday, Carlos surprised me with a party in our backyard. He strung lights between the trees and picked flowers from our garden for the tables. When I walked outside and saw him smiling that same smile that still made my heart skip, I thought life couldn't get any more perfect. But life has a peculiar way of surprising us, doesn't it? It started with innocent comments from friends. "You two look so much alike," they'd say with a laugh. Like brother and sister who found each other. I'd smile and dismiss it. After all, don't couples who've been together for decades start to resemble each other? But then the comments became more frequent, more pointed, and a small seed of doubt began to grow in my heart. Have you ever ignored a nagging feeling because the truth seemed too impossible to accept? One Sunday afternoon, while our family gathered for dinner, a distant cousin visited us. She was one of those family members who knew everyone's history, who remembered stories from decades past. As she watched Carlos serve dessert, she whispered to me, "Rosa, has anyone ever told you how much Carlos resembles your father when he was young?" My heart dropped like a stone into deep water. "The same eyes," she continued, studying his face, "the same way of walking. If I didn't know better, I'd think he was your brother." I laughed it off, but that night, lying in bed beside my sleeping husband, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For the first time in 50 years, I looked at Carlos and wondered, what if? The more I tried to push these thoughts away, the stronger they became. Every gesture, every expression, Every familiar habit now seemed suspicious. The way he frowned when concentrating, just like my father in old photographs. The way he pronounced certain words with that same gentle drawl. Have you ever felt your perfect world starting to crack, one small doubt at a time? I knew I needed answers, but I was terrified of what I might find, because sometimes the truth we fear most is the one that's been hiding in plain sight all along. "Mama," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "Dad never had other children, did he?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. My mother, who always had quick answers for everything, fumbled with her coffee cup and looked away. "Of course not, dear," she finally said, but her hands were shaking. "Why would you ask such a thing?" In that moment, I knew she was hiding something. I'd known my mother for 72 years, and I could read her like a well-worn book, but I wasn't ready to press her. Not yet. That night, memories I'd buried deep began surfacing. I remembered being a little girl and overhearing my parents argue. My mother was crying, saying something like, "You can't just pretend he doesn't exist." At the time, it meant nothing to me. Now it felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. Who was he? I began my own quiet investigation. I pulled out old photo albums and spread them across the kitchen table, examining each picture with the intensity of a detective. In photos of my father as a young man, I saw Carlos's dark eyes staring back at me. The same nose, the same smile. My hands trembled as I turned each page. Have you ever realized that your entire life might have been built on a lie? In one particular photograph, I noticed my mother holding a small child I didn't recognize. She looked tired, sad, and was standing in front of a house I'd never seen before. The child couldn't have been me. I would have recognized the clothes, the setting. Who was that baby? Driven by a growing sense of urgency, I searched through old papers tucked away in forgotten corners of my mother's house, in the back of her closet, hidden behind winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. I found a folder containing birth certificates and hospital records. My heart nearly stopped when I saw 2 birth certificates with dates so close together they couldn't both be mine. One name was partially erased, as if someone had tried to make it disappear from history. The dates, the hospital, even the doctor's signature, everything pointed to the impossible truth I'd been fighting. My mother had indeed had another child, a child she'd given up, a child born just months before me, standing there in that dusty closet, holding those yellowed papers. I felt my world tilt on its axis. Have you ever held proof of something that would destroy everything you loved? I realized I could no longer carry this burden alone. I needed to confront my mother directly, to hear the truth from her lips, no matter how painful it might be. But I was terrified of losing my happiness, my marriage, my faith in everything I thought I knew about my family. What I didn't know was that by seeking the truth, I was opening a door that could never be closed again. And the revelation waiting on the other side would be more devastating than anything I could have imagined. Have you ever stood at a crossroads, knowing that whatever path you chose would change your life forever? Some secrets are like buried treasure, except when you dig them up, you find they're not gold at all. They're dynamite that can destroy everything you hold dear. After finding those documents, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. Every detail seemed to matter now. Every silence from my mother's past suddenly had meaning. I began reaching out to older relatives, the keepers of family memories. I asked casual questions about the old days, about times when my mother seemed distant or sad. An elderly aunt mentioned something that made my blood run cold. She remembered a period when my mother had disappeared for several months, returning home different, quieter, sadder, as if she'd left part of herself somewhere else. She came back carrying such sadness, my aunt whispered. We all wondered what had happened, but she never spoke of those missing months. Another relative mentioned old rumors about my mother having a child before me. A child who, for reasons no one understood, had been given to another family. These fragments of whispered stories began forming a picture I didn't want to see. Have you ever felt pieces of a puzzle falling into place, creating an image you prayed wasn't real? I spent weeks searching through public records, old hospital files, anything that might give me concrete proof. The search was exhausting and heartbreaking, but I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth. Finally, in a dusty archive downtown, I found what I'd been looking for and dreading in equal measure: an adoption record, clear and undeniable, showing that my mother had indeed given birth to a son just months before I was born. The date, the place, the circumstances, everything matched what I'd already discovered. The baby's name was partially visible beneath decades-old ink smudges: Carlos. Sitting in that quiet archive room, surrounded by the musty smell of old paper and forgotten stories, I felt my entire world crumble. The document in my hands was like a death certificate for the life I'd known. Every happy memory with Carlos now felt tainted. Every kiss, every embrace, every moment of joy we'd shared suddenly became impossible to bear. Have you ever realized that your greatest love was also your greatest tragedy? I drove home that day in a fog of grief and disbelief. Our house, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Carlos was in the garden, humming while he watered the tomatoes, completely unaware that his wife had just discovered they were brother and sister. I watched him through the kitchen window, this man I'd loved for over 50 years, and felt as if I were seeing a stranger. How could I have been so blind? How could our entire family have lived this lie? That night, I sat at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, staring at the documents spread before me like evidence in a murder trial. In a way, they were. They were evidence of the murder of everything I'd believed about my life. I thought about all the times people had commented on our similarities, all the times I'd laughed off their observations, all the times my mother had grown quiet when Carlos was mentioned. She had known. She had always known. Have you ever felt betrayed by the person you trusted most in the world? The weight of this knowledge was crushing. I couldn't continue living with Carlos, as if nothing had changed. But how do you tell the love of your life that your entire marriage has been built on an impossible foundation? How do you look into the eyes of the man you shared a bed with for 50 years and tell him he's your brother? The truth was a bomb waiting to explode, and I was the one who would have to light the fuse. Check. Do you have the courage to destroy your own happiness if it means living honestly? The day I decided to face my mother with the truth was one of the hardest of my life. I spent the entire night awake, rehearsing what I would say, preparing for a conversation that would change our relationship forever. When I arrived at her house, the same house where I'd grown up believing in the fairy tale of our happy family, everything looked different. Every photograph on the wall, every piece of furniture, every corner seemed to be keeping secrets from me. My mother was in the kitchen, making coffee as she had thousands of times before. She looked so small and fragile, so innocent. It was hard to imagine that this gentle woman had carried such a devastating secret for decades. I waited until we were sitting face to face, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup, mine trembling as I tried to find the words. "Mama," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found the papers. I know about the baby you gave up. I know about Carlos." The color drained from her face like water from a broken pitcher. At first, she tried to deny it. Her defenses were weak, built on 50 years of lies that were finally crumbling. As I showed her the documents, the birth certificates, the adoption records, her composure began to fall apart. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, tears she'd been holding back for half a century. "I was so young," she whispered, "so scared and alone. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting you." Have you ever watched someone you love break apart before your eyes? The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. My mother had been barely 16 when she became pregnant. In those days, unmarried mothers faced shame and rejection. She had nowhere to turn, no one to help her. When the baby was born, she made the most difficult decision of her life. She gave him to a family who promised to love him, to give him opportunities she couldn't provide. But I never stopped thinking about him, she sobbed. Every day, for 50 years, I wondered where he was, what he looked like, if he was happy. Then came the most crushing revelation of all. When you brought Carlos home that first time, I knew immediately who he was. Those eyes, that smile, they were exactly like your father's, exactly like mine. I knew he was my son the moment I saw him. The room seemed to spin around me. "You knew? All these years, you knew, and you said nothing?" My mother's tears fell harder. "How could I? You were so happy. You'd found love, real love. How could I destroy that? How could I tell you that the man you'd married was your brother? Have you ever felt anger so pure and consuming that it frightened you?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to demand how she could have watched us live this lie for 50 years without saying a word. But looking at her broken form, seeing the pain she'd carried in silence all this time, I realized she was as much a victim as Carlos and I were. She had been a frightened teenager making an impossible choice. And then, years later, she became a mother watching her daughter's happiness, unable to speak the truth that would destroy it. The weight of her confession settled over both of us like a heavy blanket. We sat in silence, two women, bound by blood and separated by an unbearable truth. Have you ever forgiven someone for a betrayal that nearly destroyed you? Leaving her house that day, I carried the full weight of our family's secret. There was no going back now, no pretending I didn't know. The truth was like a cancer that would eat away at everything until it was exposed. But the hardest part still lay ahead of me. I had to go home and tell Carlos, the man I loved more than life itself, that he was my brother. I had to watch his world crumble the way mine had. Some truths are like lightning strikes. They illuminate everything in a blinding flash, but they also burn down everything in their path. Do you believe that love can survive any truth, no matter how devastating? Even with all the evidence, even with my mother's confession, a part of me still hoped I was wrong. Hope, it turns out, can be the cruelest emotion of all. I needed absolute proof. I needed something that would eliminate even the smallest doubt, because the consequences of being right were too devastating to accept on anything less than certainty. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, I collected a strand of Carlos's hair from his brush. I gathered my own sample and drove to a laboratory across town where nobody knew our story. The wait for results was torture. 3 weeks of pretending everything was normal while dying inside. 3 weeks of watching Carlos tend his garden, make his morning coffee, and smile at me with the same loving eyes that had captivated me at 15. Have you ever lived with a secret so heavy you thought it might crush you? When the envelope finally arrived, I held it for an hour before finding the courage to open it. Such a small thing, really, just a piece of paper. But I knew it held the power to destroy 2 lives. The results were clinical, impersonal, definitive. 99.97% probability that Carlos and I were full siblings. I stared at those numbers until they blurred through my tears. There was no more room for doubt, no more hoping for a mistake. The science was clear, brutal, and final. We were brother and sister. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of love, 50 years of building a life together, and it had all been built on an impossible foundation. That night, I sat in our bedroom, and looked at family photos covering the dresser. Our wedding day, the births of our children, birthdays, anniversaries, grandchildren's graduations, a lifetime of joy that now felt like a lie. How do you reconcile loving someone completely with knowing that love was forbidden from the very beginning? The morning, Carlos was humming in the garden, completely unaware that his wife had become a stranger to him overnight. He waved at me through the kitchen window. That familiar, loving gesture I'd seen thousands of times. But now I saw my father in that wave. I saw my own eyes looking back at me. Have you ever had to choose between your own peace of mind and someone else's happiness? I knew I couldn't carry this secret alone any longer. It was eating me alive, poisoning every moment of joy, turning our beautiful memories into sources of pain. Carlos deserved to know the truth, no matter how devastating it would be. That afternoon, as he sat reading the newspaper in his favorite chair, the chair he'd occupied every evening for decades, I placed the DNA results on the table beside him. "We need to talk," I said. my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. The confusion in his eyes as he read the papers was heartbreaking. I watched understanding dawn slowly, like a terrible sunrise, illuminating a landscape of devastation. "This can't be right," he whispered. "This has to be a mistake." But deep down, we both knew it wasn't. All those comments from friends over the years, all those similarities we'd laughed off, they suddenly made horrible sense. Carlos aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The man I'd loved transformed before my eyes into someone I barely recognized. My brother, learning that his entire life had been built on an impossible love. Do you believe some truths are too painful to survive? The silence that followed was deafening. 50 years of conversation, of shared dreams and whispered secrets, reduced to nothing. We were strangers again, siblings who had unknowingly committed the ultimate taboo. Our perfect love story had become our greatest tragedy. That was 5 years ago. 5 years since my world crumbled and rebuilt itself into something I never could have imagined. The separation was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Dividing a life, boxing up memories, nearly broke what was left of my explaining to children and grandchildren why their stable, loving grandparents were suddenly living apart. It hurt. But sometimes breaking apart is the only way to heal. I moved to a small apartment across town. For months, I barely functioned. I'd wake up reaching for Carlos, forgetting for those first few seconds that he was no longer my husband. The grief was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Mourning someone who was still alive. Mourning a love that had been real and beautiful, but impossible. Slowly, with the help of a support group for women facing life transitions, I began to rebuild. I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever known. I discovered parts of myself that had been hidden beneath 50 years of being half of a couple. My relationship with my mother required forgiveness that came slowly, in waves. I came to understand that she too had been a victim of circumstances, of a time when women had fewer choices and single mothers faced unbearable shame. As for Carlos and me, we had to create a new relationship from the ashes of our marriage. It took years, but we found a way to be family in the truest sense. Siblings who shared history, love, and a profound understanding of loss. He remains one of the most important people in my life, though our relationship will never be simple. Love doesn't disappear just because circumstances make it impossible. It transforms, finding new shapes and meanings we never expected. Have you ever discovered that your greatest tragedy was also your greatest teacher? Today, I know that life continues even after our worst nightmares come true. I learned that happiness doesn't require a perfect story. It requires the courage to keep writing new chapters, even when the old ones end in ways we never imagined. I found joy again, different from before, but no less real. I've learned to value truth over comfort, growth over safety, and the surprising strength that comes from surviving the impossible. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to know that even the most devastating truths can lead to new beginnings. And next week, I'll tell you about Martha, who discovered something hidden in her grandmother's hope chest that changed 3 generations of women. What would you do if you discovered your entire life had been built on a secret? Remember, subscribe to our channel for stories that remind us that we're stronger than we know, more resilient than we imagine, and that every ending, no matter how painful, can become a new beginning. Because sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives are the ones we write after we thought the story was over. What new chapter are you ready to write in your own life?